A man in India wrote in asking what I mean when I write about non-lucrative languages. This is a question that a lot of you might have, so let me answer it here. We are all familiar with the resources for English, because we're speaking English here, and perhaps a few other languages, usually languages spoken in wealthy places, and with a lot of tools, a lot of dictionaries, a lot of research, a lot of things that you can do with your apparatus. We have some sort of sense of differences between those languages and English and the other big ones, French or Spanish or German or Chinese. What we don't really know how to do is talk about all the other languages, the other 7,000 languages out there. These are languages where corporations don't really see an opportunity for making money, where there are no careers, where there isn't much funding from official sources or from charities or foundations or philanthropists. And that's really the commonality, that there's not money to be made in these languages, and therefore resources don't get developed, don't get built for these languages. Some of these languages are endangered. They're spoken by fewer and fewer people, and for one reason or another, there's a possibility that they'll disappear in not that many years. Some of these languages fit into a category called minority languages, but many languages that are non-lucrative are not minority languages per se. They're spoken by millions and millions of people. You can't make money working in Bengali, but Bengali is spoken by hundreds of millions of people. People often refer to indigenous languages. Indigenous languages are really languages that were spoken by people before more powerful groups came and kind of took over the linguistic landscape of the areas they're living in. They might be endangered, but not all non-lucrative languages are quote-unquote indigenous. People often use the term mother tongues. Mother tongue is a bit too broad. English is my mother tongue, and English is the most lucrative language. There's the term under-resourced languages, and that's similar to non-lucrative, but it kind of skirts the question of what resources are we talking about. It's part of a bigger discussion. It's a more academic discussion, I think, than talking about the wealth resources. What are the resources that we're talking about? What are the right resources? What are necessary resources? What are bells and whistles? Which diffuses the discussion rather than saying, okay, the distinguishing feature here really is money, whether or not the resources get produced and come into existence. Sometimes people will talk about less commonly taught languages. That is a question of what languages are taught at universities in places like the United States. But a language like Japanese might be a less commonly taught language. It's also a lucrative language, so that's not part of this discussion. Some non-lucrative languages are in fact national languages, have some sort of recognition by the country in which they're spoken. It could be languages like Bambara or Soninke or Fula or Songhai and spoken in Mali, where the government recognizes that the languages are important, but there's still not any financial backing to bring them up to an equitable situation. Another term I've sometimes used is non-wealthy languages. I moved over towards non-lucrative because to me that speaks a little bit more towards the barriers ahead than to the history behind. If we can separate that out, we can put it into two problems. There's the money problem and there's the language problem. The language problems can be solved by linguists and technologists. The money problem is important. Let's label it, let's identify it, so then we can go and do the work that's needed for the 7,000 languages that are not going to make any money on their own. By talking about non-lucrative, we're recognizing, okay, for investors, there is no return on investment. Markets are either small or they're untested, people don't believe in them. I actually think that if you develop core resources that can be used for a lot of different languages, you can end up having products that bring back return on investment, but that's not something that investors have seen to date. Another common factor for non-lucrative languages is that there's no career path for people to do research in universities or elsewhere. There are no scholarships for students to go and study languages like these, and there are no jobs for people who have backgrounds in these less researched or less resourced languages. For people working in language technology, all the data sets are in English and the other big languages. There are also basically no grants from governments or from foundations for preservation, for documentation, for developing advanced technologies for most of these languages. It's not necessarily something that funders believe can or should happen. There are no jobs within the technology sector for people to develop, say, software in a particular language. Companies see the bulk of their sales happening in languages at the top of the resource pyramid, and so they don't think of creating jobs for people who are working in languages outside of the technology mainstream. This is all made more difficult by the fact that there are no foundational tools for doing the sort of work that would be needed to produce resources for non-lucrative languages. If you don't have data sets, you don't have a corpus. If you have to start from scratch, you have to build it all up yourself. That's a total sink of time and money. People working in English have decades and decades of research and experience that they can draw upon. People working in non-lucrative languages, if they have to start from essentially zero and are trying to get to the same level as people who are starting way up there, face a lot of disincentives for even trying to get started. So often there's public interest spiritually in saying, okay, yeah, we should do something about these languages. but very little ends up happening because that does not end up getting converted into the work that would need to be done hundreds, thousands of times over to really produce equity for hundreds or thousands of languages for which there's not really a possibility of making money anytime soon. To the person who wrote in, I hope that answers your question. To everybody else, I hope it answers a bit this question of why even some of the largest languages have so few resources, that many languages are not minority, they're not endangered. They are embattled in that their speakers face a lot of disadvantages in competing in the global knowledge economy. But the real commonality is the fact of not being attractive to funders and investors and therefore not being able to push forward into the technological realm or into the economic world that depends on that sort of investment. I filmed this video with a couple of things in mind. One is the things that I do with the Academy of African Languages. Another is things I do with an organization called UNIDIVE, which stands for Universality, Diversity, and Idiosyncrasy in Language. It's an EU-sponsored organization that's trying to get at some of these language issues. So there's a link to UNIDIVE if you'd like to know more about the action. As I said at the outset, I made this video in response to a reader's question. So if you have questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll see if I'm able to answer them in a future video. If you're able to support the making of these videos, please check out the Patreon link. Please make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, that really helps. Please also let other people know about this video and about the channel, that also really helps. And please think about what it means if you're a speaker of a less lucrative language and there are no resources for your language. Stay tuned for future videos that delve into what we might be able to do for non-lucrative languages and the people who speak them.